Chapter 1. The tracks were fresh. They were well off the beaten path in the thick of nature, where no human had walked in decades. At least, not on purpose. But the wet earth had made for solid boot imprints that didn't belong amongst the wild. The early morning mist blanketed the forest, and moisture hung heavy. The first few rays of sun had finally risen above the mountain ridge, casting a long shadow across the west side of the forest.
"Is he close?"
Sheriff Tommy Rockwell panted, catching his breath as they paused near the tracks in the dirt. The steep uphill climb on the mountainside had been difficult, and the sheriff wasn't accustomed to moving through the mountains. But for Forest Ranger Lacey Stone, protecting the wilderness extended beyond her duties in uniform. This was her home. And there was a wolf in the henhouse.
"Lacey?"
Lacey held up her hand, silencing the sheriff. He had been noisy the entire hike. He didn't appreciate silence as she did, and didn't understand how every noise in the forest served a purpose. The light patter of hooves and paws and the wind through the trees were the pulse of the woods. The forest had no use for the noise of humans in these protected areas of the park. Lacey remained crouched, knees in the dirt, her green eyes blending into the foliage. She often felt like nothing more than a watcher in these woods, a silent sentry of the land she had been charged to protect. After a pause, Lacey stood. "He's at least a mile ahead of us," Lacey said.
"Are you sure?" Tommy asked. "I don't even know where we are."
"I do," Lacey answered, glancing at Tommy behind her. "I told you it would be a long hike."
"I didn't think it'd be up the mountain,"
Tommy said. The pair had been tracking a poacher plaguing the park for 6 months. Lacey had found remnants of the traps used to ensnare animals. But the traps this poacher were using were designed to keep the animals alive. He was trying to sell them, but for what and to whom, she didn't know. All Lacey knew for certain was the type of animal the poacher was hunting. Bears. The Park Service tracked over 20 different black bears in that forest to study their movements and monitor the population. Most poachers avoided tagged animals because they didn't want to draw attention to themselves. They knew the moment the animal was dead and the tag was removed, it would raise a red flag. It was much easier for a poacher to kill an animal that wasn't being tracked, but this particular poacher didn't follow those rules. So far, he had boldly taken out several bears in the area, which were part of a protected class in their state. During her 20-year career working for the North Carolina Parks Department, Lacey had encountered poachers before, but this was the first time she'd chased someone so elusive. The poacher had moved through the forest like an apex predator, taking what he wanted with little regard for the balance of nature. The animals in this forest were all protected for a reason. Lacey believed in preserving the natural order of life. The poacher did not. Lacey was a hunter herself, but she understood the difference between killing to live and killing for sport. Every animal Lacey hunted was for the sole purpose of feeding her family, and no portion of the kill was wasted. Hides were skinned, antlers sharpened and fastened into tools. Every piece of the animal had a purpose. The pair continued for a bit longer, the sheriff struggling the entire way, and after another half-mile, Lacey stopped. "You're making too much noise," Lacey said.
"No, I'm not,"
Tommy replied.
"I'm quiet as a church mouse back here."
Lacey didn't point out that he was currently sucking wind like he was having a heart attack. "You want to know why we haven't seen any animals on our trip yet? It's because they hear you coming a mile away. The poacher we're hunting is better at hiding than you think. If he hears us, he'll most likely try to shoot us."
"I guess that's why I have this,"
Tommy said, patting the pistol at his side, but adding a smile. "This isn't a laughing matter," Lacey replied. "This man is dangerous. He's a killer, and I don't think he'll hesitate to kill us."
"Right. Sorry,"
Tommy said.
"This is your jurisdiction. I'll follow your lead."
Lacey faced forward again, and the pair continued. Lacey knew Tommy meant well. The pair had known each other for a long time, but there were some elements of their past she'd rather forget. It had been a long time since Lacey's husband had died. Yet, she still felt the repercussions of his death even now. Her husband's death was a catastrophic event for her entire family. It had rocked them to their core, and despite Lacey's steady hand to guide them through, the damage had already been done. Lacey had convinced herself time would heal them. But it had been 5 years since Sean's death, and her family was still torn to pieces about it. The open wounds refused to heal, and Lacey didn't know how much longer it would take to close that chapter of her life. After another half-mile, Lacey stopped, forcing Tommy to bump into her. She held up her hand and silenced him before he could speak. The scent of smoke caught the breeze, the kind from a camp. Lacey gestured with her hands that they were close, and Tommy nodded. The pair drew their weapons, moving as quietly as they could toward the camp's edge, and Lacey followed the smoke as it grew stronger. They eventually stumbled upon a small clearing where a tent was set up. The flap was open, but it was empty. Lacey held their position. Thankful the sheriff was the quietest he'd been on the whole trip, and after a few minutes, Lacey motioned for Tommy to come closer. "I'll go around the other side, and we'll meet in the middle." "Make sure we have the camp surrounded," Lacey said. Tommy nodded, and Lacey quietly moved through the brush to reach the backside of the poacher's campsite. Once she was in position, she and Tommy infiltrated the camp. The fire had been put out with water recently, and the campsite was bare bones, but what caught Lacey's attention were the traps. The iron claws, meant to snap and ensnare the large animals that roamed these woods. Breaking bones and causing excruciating pain, left to sit and suffer until the poacher returned, only to tranquilize them and cage them, sending them to the highest bidder. It was cowardice to set those traps. There was no honor in hunting that way. "He's not here," Tommy said, but he kept his gun out. "Do you think he's coming back?" Before Lacey answered, a twig snapped nearby. Both Tommy and Lacey reacted to the noise, aiming in the direction of the sound. For most people, it was hard to see beyond the trees, leaves, and the dense foliage surrounding them. But Lacey's eyes had adapted to the woods, and she was able to pick out things that didn't belong, like a harsh black of a boot tip behind a tree. Lacey fired at the tree trunk, and the poacher sprinted away. Lacey took chase, leaving Tommy in the dust as she maneuvered through the woods. She ignored Tommy's cries to slow down, refusing to lose their one shot at catching this predator. The poacher was faster than he looked, but Lacey was quick on her feet. Her husband had always called her a mountain goat because she was sturdy on uneven ground of the forest terrain. Eventually, the poacher stopped, ducking behind a cluster of rocks, and Lacey found cover behind a tree. No one moved. Neither party was willing to expose themselves, but the longer Lacey remained behind the tree, the more time she had to study the terrain between her and the poacher. If this man was as good at hunting as Lacey believed he was, then why would he run? Why not use his rifle and take a shot at them? And that was when Lacey studied the ground between herself and the poacher. Anyone else looking at the ground would see nothing but dirt and leaves. But there were subtle tells of the unnatural mounds that occupied the ground. Even animals wouldn't recognize them. Lacey had seen these kinds of traps before, and she'd had a keen eye for tripwires because she'd used them herself at her homestead. Tommy finally caught up with Lacey, and she held him back. She gestured to the rocks where the poacher had taken cover. "Distract him," Lacey whispered to Tommy before she slipped away. Lacey slipped soundlessly to the left, while Tommy barked out orders for the poacher to come out with his hands up. Lacey focused on the cluster of trees, her feet finding solid footing without her ever having to look down. "I'm not going to tell you again," Tommy shouted. "Come out with your hands up! You have 5 seconds to comply." Lacey moved as quickly as possible without sacrificing her stealth. But the closer Tommy counted to 0, Lacey forewent her stealth the last few feet and pounced on the poacher's location. The poacher was so focused on Tommy's voice that he hadn't noticed Lacey's approach until she had her gun against the back of his head.
"Don't move,"
Lacey said. The poacher froze.
"No one's ever gotten the jump on me before." "You're quiet."
"I'm persistent," Lacey said. "Toss the rifle to the left." "Put your hands behind your head. Nice and slow." The poacher did as he was told, giving up his weapon and placing his hands behind his head for Lacey to restrain. Once he was detained, she picked him up and walked him back to the sheriff, mindful to avoid the traps he'd set.
"Nice work, Lace,"
Tommy said, and he took the poacher into custody.
"I don't want to see you in my forest again," Lacey said.
The poacher smiled.
"Then you should have killed me."
Lacey had caught poachers before, but there was something different about this one. It was the distant look in his eye, as if he were there with them physically, but mentally somewhere else. And his eyes had a yellow tint, a sinister, poisonous color.
"Let's get moving," Lacey said. "We have a long hike back."
Lacey and Tommy dragged the poacher back to his campsite and did some more reconnaissance. They found his passport and flight scheduled back to China. That was all Lacey needed to know.
"Bile farms,"
Lacey said, and she handed the papers to Tommy.
"What is that?"
Tommy asked. "The bile in bears is considered a medicinal property in China," Lacey said. "They have farms where the animals are kept alive while the bile is drained from their gallbladders. It's torture." Tommy grimaced and opened the poacher's passport.
"Well, it doesn't look like you'll be doing that anymore, Mr. Eddie Crouch."
Eddie said nothing, keeping his head down while Lacey and Tommy collected what resources they could carry from the poacher's camp. Then, Lacey noted the coordinates on her satellite GPS, but when she tried to save them, the device died. Lacey had always preferred more traditional forms of navigation, like a compass and a map, which she used to help guide them back.
"I thought those GPS satellites were supposed to be foolproof,"
Tommy asked. "Nothing is ever foolproof in the wild," Lacey said. There wasn't much talk on the way back, and Lacey was thankful. There was little she enjoyed these days, but the silence of the woods still gave her pleasure. It was a good change of pace from the bickering and arguing that followed her everywhere else, even at home. But her son was off at college now, pursuing medicine at Wake Forest. He couldn't have been happier about the move, but Lacey had mixed feelings. The pair had never fully repaired their relationship before Dusty had left for school, which always irked Lacey. She hoped she had more time, but ever since her husband's death, she knew tomorrow was never promised. When they neared Big Rock State Park Welcome Center, where they had begun their journey, the sun was already high in the sky, and several vehicles were in the parking lot. It was the beginning of spring, and the park was starting to enter its busy season. But the moment Lacey reached the building, she could tell something was wrong. Several visitors were out by their cars, all with their hoods up, scratching their heads as they examined the vehicles.
"What's this about?"
Tommy asked.
"I don't know,"
Lacey answered. Before she reached the building, one of Lacey's officers sprinted out of the door. He was young, barely 3 months on the job. He had green eyes like her son.
"Warden,"
Billy said, catching his breath.
"The power's out. The phones aren't working, and people are getting nervous."
Lacey stood there, taking in the moment and everything that was happening. Between the busted cars, people staring at their blank phones, the loss of power, and the fact that her satellite phone wasn't working. She realized one improbable event had come to pass. An EMP.
Chapter 2. "You will have 60 seconds to assess the patient before diagnosing," Professor Edwards said, pacing in front of the class. "When it comes to life and death, time is your greatest enemy."
It was the first lab of the day. All the students were dressed in white coats, not because they were doctors yet, but because the professor wanted this exercise to feel as authentic as possible.
They were all second-year pre-med students hoping to make an early impression with Dr. Edwards, Wake Forest Medical School Dean of Admission. Everyone was nervous, but no one was more anxious than Dusty Stone. He stood in front of the class. He had prepped all night for every scenario he could think of, but the late night had made him groggy this morning. He had chugged coffee, doing everything he could to stay awake, but he had struggled to get out of bed. Thankfully, Dusty's adrenaline had kicked in now that he was in class. Professor Edwards glanced at the class, and then studied his clipboard.
"Why don't we have Mr. Stone go first?"
Dusty tensed, but then he quickly stepped forward, hoping no one noticed his trembling hands as he picked up the patient's file. The exercise was a simple one. The mannequin had a medical history and was currently unconscious and on life support. The students were tasked with figuring out what had happened.
"Time starts now, Mr. Stone," Edward said.
Dusty quickly scanned the patient's chart, noting the patient's history of heart disease and the current medications he was taking. According to the chart, the patient had suffered a mild stroke 18 months ago, but until he was hospitalized for his current ailment, he had been in good health and his numbers were improving. Dusty said, and he cleared his throat. And he felt himself freezing up. He couldn't bring himself to look at anything except the medical chart. His heart hammering in his chest.
"Tick-tock, Mr. Stone,"
Edward said. A few of the students behind him snickered, but were quickly shushed by another peer. A girl. And Dusty knew who to thank for it.
"Judging by his history with heart disease and the fact that his blood pressure is high, I would say he had a more severe stroke,"
Dusty said.
"And how would you know that?" Edwards asked. "The patient's current blood pressure is stabilized and normal, and there have been no MRI scans to confirm a stroke."
"Right," Dusty said, gritting his teeth and kicking himself. He had been looking at the blood pressure measured on the chart when the patient was brought in. Not his current numbers, which were shown on the machine.
30 seconds left, Mr. Stone,"
Edwards replied. Dusty racked his brain. Scanning the chart and the patient's current status, Dusty noted the patient's oxygen levels were low, dangerously low, even on air support. "A blood clot in the lungs," Dusty said.
"Very good, Mr. Stone,"
Edwards answered.
"And just in the nick of time. But you won't be dealing with stuffed dummies in a hospital room. This exercise aims to get you to think on your feet. The stakes of our profession are life and death. We must ensure every step forward we take in a patient's care is the right one. You can rejoin your classmates, Mr. Stone."
Dusty stepped back into the cluster of students, standing next to Claire Bowers, who smiled at him. "Good job," Claire said, whispering in his ear. The semester had been difficult, especially with the early morning classes combined with the late nights of studying, but the pretty redhead next to him had made the days infinitely more bearable. Professor Edwards was about to summon the next student when the power shut off and the classroom went dark, save for a few beams of morning sunlight coming through the windows high above them on the walls. The students cheered, but Professor Edwards quickly quelled everyone's excitement.
"Please, everyone, stay where you are, and we'll get this sorted out momentarily."
When the professor left the lab room, everyone whispered about how they hoped the day was canceled.
"Maybe the power to the whole school is out,"
one said. "We should head over to the lake and pick a good spot on the shore before it's all taken," another replied.
"Wouldn't it be great if the power was out for a whole week?"
The chatter was excited and hopeful, but when Dusty reached for his phone to check the time, he noticed his screen was completely blank. He frowned, thinking his phone was dead, but he remembered charging it last night. And then Dusty noticed the other students and their blank phone screens. In a society connected by the internet, where the world was at your fingertips at the press of a button, everyone was so accustomed to knowing whatever they wanted in an instant. But now that information highway was shut down. Professor Edwards returned, raising his voice to silence the class.
"Okay, it looks like the whole school might be down. So we'll call it a day until this gets sorted out. Not sure what the problem is, but...
Our phones aren't working, one student yelled out. The class hummed in agreement, and Dusty watched the professor stand there with a deer-in-the-headlights expression as he confirmed that his phone wasn't working either. But while the rest of the class might have been struggling for answers, Dusty had a sinking suspicion he knew what it was. He grabbed a hold of Claire's hand and whispered in her ear. "We need to go," Dusty said. Claire frowned. "What's wrong?" It was hard to explain. Dusty was embarrassed to even speak it out loud, but the combination of both the power being out and their phones no longer working led him to one improbable conclusion. "Dusty?" Claire asked. "Do you know what's going on?" A nearby student overheard Claire's comment and perked up.
Hey, Stone knows something.
The excitement spread like wildfire, and everyone turned toward Dusty and Claire in the darkness.
I don't know exactly what's going on,
Dusty said, but then he saw how desperate everyone looked and chose to share his thoughts.
I think this is an EMP.
Everyone looked at Dusty as if he had horns growing out of his face.
A what?
A kid asked. An electromagnetic pulse, Dusty answered. It renders anything with a microprocessing chip useless. Again, people were confused. But then Claire stepped in to clarify. It's why your phones aren't working and the power's out.
Yes,
Dusty said.
And most cars won't work because of the computer-controlled ignition systems.
So, nothing is working? A student asked. How long will this last?
I don't know, Dusty answered. It depends on how widespread the outage is. But right now, I think everyone should head home. Get food and water, enough to last you at least 3 days. If you can, go to family members outside of the city.
Out of the city? Why? Another girl asked.
Because if this blackout is across the whole state or country, then populated areas will become increasingly dangerous,
Dusty said.
Dusty had never meant to trigger panic. But he didn't want to sugarcoat the situation. This wasn't a vacation from school or a prolonged weekend. Every major public utility service would be shut down. When people realized no help was coming, when the food in their pantries ran out or their prescriptions emptied, that was when the fighting would begin. It was the kind of future Dusty's mother had wanted him to be ready for, and the same reason why he was so eager to leave. Dusty had a knack for medicine, and his father's death had prompted him to pursue medical school. He wanted to save people. Gunshots, loud and in quick succession, caught everyone's attention. The group of students shuddered as they stared at the door.
What was that?
Claire asked, tightening her grip on Dusty's hand.
Fireworks?
One of the students asked, frightened. Dusty had hunted with his mother. He knew the difference between the sound of a gunshot and the sound of a firework. It was a distinctive type of blast, and there was no mistaking what they'd heard. Dusty walked toward the lab's exit, pulled toward the shouts and screams, and also out of curiosity. He had never shied away from danger. His childhood had assured that, but Claire grabbed his arm and pulled him back.
Don't,
Claire said. Just stay here. I'll be right back, Dusty reassured her. Even though Claire didn't look happy with his decision, she let him go and stayed in the classroom with the others while Dusty sprinted toward the exit. While in the hallway, he could see through the courtyard windows. A vast open square was in the center of campus between their building and the one across from it. Students were lying motionless on the grass, and men in masks with automatic rifles marched over their dead bodies, shooting anything and everything that stood in their path. Dusty was shocked at first, but then his shock was replaced with anger. He clenched his fists at his sides, nails digging into his palms. There was a boy, still alive, bloodied, and crawling toward safety. He was currently out of view of the other shooters, but he wouldn't escape without help. Dusty raced toward the door, hoping to reach the student before he bled out or the terrorists found him.
But just as he opened the door, another gunshot rang out. The boy lay motionless on the ground. A bullet to the head stopped his efforts. His gray matter sprayed over the grass and concrete. And standing above him, gun in hand, was the masked terrorist who killed him. The terrorist looked up from the dead student, locked eyes with Dusty, and started a slow, ominous march toward him. Chapter 3. The crowd of tourists was restless. It was only a matter of time before their worried whispers turned to violent actions. But Lacey had other problems on her mind than just her duties as a forest ranger. Lacey's first thought was of her daughter, Katie, attending school in town. If this was an EMP, she needed to get to her immediately. The second thought was of her son in Winston-Salem, 30 miles south. She was less worried about him. He was smart and had a good head on his shoulders and knew what to do. But she hoped he wasn't too stubborn to stay in the city instead of heading to their homestead.
Lacey?
Billy asked, standing in front of her with a helpless expression. Lacey stepped forward, filling the vacant space of leadership that no one else had the courage to step into, and pulled Billy to the side and away from the ears of the growing crowd.
Move everyone into town,
Lacey said.
None of the vehicles are working,
Billy said.
And not everyone will be able to make that long walk.
We have some old trucks in the storage shed that should work, Lacey said, knowing they predated the standardization of computer-controlled fuel injectors.
What is going on?
Billy asked, not bothering to keep his voice down.
We don't have power, no communications, no transportation. What could do this?
The crowd was shifting closer to Lacey and Billy, slowly encompassing them, hungry for answers. There was no sense in keeping what she knew a secret. We've been attacked by an EMP, Lacey said. Nothing is untouched by this, and until we know who is behind this or how widespread it is, we must all remain calm and find a place to ride this out. Lacey figured most visitors were from out of town, meaning they had stayed at the hotels. Lacey turned to Tommy, who still had Eddie in custody. Anyone from out of town will head back with the sheriff, Lacey said, volunteering Tommy. He didn't look upset, and she faced the crowd again. If you're a local, go home. Get a checklist of your food and water and ensure you have enough for a few days at least.
I'll reach out to anyone over the radio,
Tommy said, stepping in to help Lacey with the burden of leadership.
That's if it works?
He looked at Lacey. Unless it was protected in a Faraday cage, it won't, Lacey said. The crowd was calm for now, but Lacey saw the writing on the wall as she studied their faces. There would be food shortages, no fresh water to drink because the taps weren't working, and there would be no medicine for those who needed life-saving drugs each day. The world had been turning so fast, and now it had stopped. And while people complained that life moved too quickly, they were about to find out what happened when it came to a screeching halt. The most important thing you can do right now is stay calm, Lacey said. Work together, help each other. That's what we're going to do, and I can promise you that my team will... Lacey was the first to notice the sound of the engine. It was easy to pick out of the silence, and as the others heard it, they all turned toward the road. Someone's coming, a woman said, and she smiled. Someone's coming to help. Lacey noticed how fast the engine was churning. There was anger in its speed. Get everyone inside, Lacey said, looking at Billy. Go, now! Billy stood there, frozen like a deer caught in the headlights, but Lacey didn't sit idle. She pushed the group toward the welcome center, everyone stumbling along like a herd of cattle. By the time the truck revealed itself on the final turn from the road into the parking lot, all hell broke loose when the shooting started. The gunmen on the back of the truck had their rifles ready and opened fire into the crowd, striking a few and killing them instantly while the rest of the crowd scattered. Lacey quickly moved to defend the crowd from the approaching enemy. She fired at the truck first, forcing the driver to veer away from the group.
Lacey quickly realized they wouldn't make it to the welcome center in time, and even if they did, it would be impossible to defend. "To the woods!" Lacey shouted. "To the woods, now!" Lacey continued to provide cover fire, and Tommy, Billy, and some other forest ranger employees helped guide the visitors toward the woods. When everyone was clear, Lacey and Tommy, who had Eddie in his handcuffs, waved for Lacey to join them.
"Lacey, come on!"
Tommy shouted. But Lacey remained at the edge of the woods, watching the enemy circle the parking lot. Another truck arrived and parked by the trailhead from where Lacey and Tommy had come, the one that took them to the cliffs. It was the highest point in Big Rock and the main attraction for people who visited the spectacular mountain views. Lacey watched as something was unloaded and noticed that the enemy had circled the truck as a priority. But 3 other shooters had broken away and sprinted toward Lacey. Lacey disappeared into the woods to catch up with Tommy and the others. When she found them, they had to stop to take a break. "We need to keep going," Lacey said, looking at everyone in the eye.
"I know you're tired and scared, but everyone needs to move right now."
The masked gunmen's voices carried through the woods, and everyone shuddered with fear.
"Come on, let's move,"
Tommy said, clapping his hands and pushing the group deeper into the woods. "Good, keep going," Lacey said. "Quick as you can." Billy took the reins of handling the tourists, and Tommy hung back with Lacey. Eddie was still at his side, calmer than anyone.
"I don't think we'll make it with this large group," Tommy said. "They're going to catch up with us."
"We can't save everyone," Lacey said.
"I know," Tommy replied, "but we can try."
Tommy had always been a do-gooder, but he didn't understand the reality of their situation. The people they were guiding through the woods weren't hikers, and the terrain they were about to cover would be rugged. And with the terrorists hunting them and the uncertain terrain ahead, their likelihood of survival was low. Chapter 4. "Keep going," Lacey said, leading the pack through the woods. The group was already growing tired, and each time Lacey glanced behind her, she saw the distance between them and the terrorists shrink.
"Why are they still chasing us?"
Tommy asked. Tommy, Lacey, and Eddie were at the front of the pack. Lacey had positioned Billy at the back of the group to ensure no one fell behind or slowed down. Billy might have been green on the job, but his resume was impressive. He had been a recreational hunter growing up, and until his hire with the Forest Ranger's office, he had specialized in hunting tours during the season. When Lacey asked him why he wanted to work in the forestry division, when he could make far more money in the private sector, Billy shrugged. "I don't want to kill things anymore," Billy said. Lacey understood that sentiment, especially after the death of her husband.
"Lacey, wait,"
Tommy said, reaching for her arm. Lacey turned around and saw that the tourists had stopped moving. A heavy-set man who was their slowest was hunched forward and struggled to catch his breath.
"I can't," he said. "I'm sorry, but I just can't go any farther."
"We don't have time to slow down," Lacey said. "We need to keep going."
"It's too hard,"
the man replied, waving his arm.
"Go on without me."
"Do you have children?" Lacey asked. The man looked up at her.
"What?"
"Do you have children or family?" Lacey asked.
"2 daughters,"
he asked. "Then keep moving for them," Lacey answered. "You're staying alive for their benefit, not yours. Do you think they want their father to die today? You think they don't want you around for holidays and birthdays anymore?" The father straightened up, still huffing and puffing, but he had a more determined expression in his eyes.
"It's okay," he said. "I can do it for them."
"Good," Lacey said, and then she looked at the rest of the tourists, all of whom were in varying stages of fatigue. "That goes for all of you. Find someone beyond yourself to keep going. Family, friends, whatever it is that you love, and hold tight to it, because this journey is only going to become harder." Lacey had never considered herself a motivational speaker, but she saw how everyone looked at her. She had spoken the truth,
giving them all a small piece of hope to cling to in uncertain times. And for the path ahead, they would need to dig as deep as they could to survive. But when Lacey spun around to face Tommy, Eddie quickly tripped up Tommy and sprinted into the woods. "Shit," Tommy said, landing hard on his backside. Lacey chased after Eddie without hesitating while Tommy struggled to get back to his feet, but she waved him off. "Stay with the tourists." It was a steep decline from their current path, and Lacey had to make sure she didn't tumble head over foot down the side of the mountain. The last thing she wanted was to break her neck while chasing after the man. But Eddie was quicker and surer on his feet than Lacey expected. While she might have been able to move quickly down the side of the mountain, Eddie was sprinting. Of course, he had nothing to lose and desperately wanted to escape. Lacey managed to track him all the way to the bottom of the ravine, where Eddie ducked behind a boulder. Lacey succeeded in keeping up with him long enough to have an eye on him, but she paused when she noticed him duck behind a boulder. Eddie had all the momentum, and for him to stop so suddenly was a cause for concern. Unless, of course, he was injured, but Lacey heard no cries of pain. No, this was something different. The terrain had finally leveled out a bit as they neared the end of the ravine, but it was the ground that Lacey studied closely. The last thing she wanted was to be caught off guard by a trap. Years of hunting had sharpened Lacey's senses. In many aspects, she sometimes felt that she was more animal than human. But as Lacey studied the ground ahead, she saw no signs of a trap. She slowly approached the rock, unsure if he had hidden a weapon down there, but when she neared the rock and found Eddie, he was simply sitting on the ground, wrists still cuffed. "Where did you think you could go?" Lacey asked.
"You saw how close those men were getting to the group,"
Eddie answered, gesturing to the ridge.
"We weren't moving fast enough. And I wasn't about to wait up there and be shot in the back."
"No more games," Lacey said. "We need to go back now."
"And what are we going back to?"
Eddie asked.
"We go back up to those people, and we'll all die."
"Come on," Lacey said. "Let's get moving." Eddie hesitated, and for a moment, Lacey thought she might have to drag him up the ravine, something she wasn't excited about. Then she heard movement above and saw Tommy making his way down.
"Sorry about that,"
Tommy said, forcing Eddie to stand. Lacey was annoyed, but chose to move on. "Just make sure he doesn't—" A gunshot at the top of the ravine caused all three of them to glance up. But when Lacey stepped forward, Eddie tripped her. Thankfully, Lacey caught herself just before she fell, but she skinned her palms on the twigs and rocks, stopping her face from smashing into the rocky ground. When Lacey stood, she cocked her arm back to punch Eddie, but he stepped back.
"You go up there, and we're all dead,"
Eddie said. Lacey paused. Eddie didn't strike her as someone who was scared easily.
"I've been watching them,"
Eddie said.
"The terrorists?"
Tommy asked.
"You've known they were here? For how long?" "Couple of weeks,"
Eddie answered.
"I've seen them scout in the woods. I don't know what they're doing or what they're looking for, but the moment I saw them, I knew they were dangerous." "How would you know that?"
Tommy asked.
"Because a predator can recognize another predator,"
Eddie answered, then looked at Lacey.
"Can't we?"
Lacey didn't appreciate the insinuation, but there were more gunshots and screams at the top of the ravine. And while Eddie didn't want them to go, Lacey wasn't about to allow him to control their decisions. The trio marched back up the ravine, moving as fast as they could without drawing too much attention to themselves. As they neared the top, Lacey slowed as she watched a group of armed and masked men march the tourists and Billy backward toward the parking lot and the welcome center. Lacey ran through scenarios and knew they couldn't engage the enemy without significant collateral damage. It would be a bloodbath, and Lacey didn't want to risk any further loss of life. But one thing was clear. Whoever these people were, they were very organized, violent, and had a plan. Lacey just needed to figure out what that plan entailed.
Chapter 5. Dusty retreated into the building as the terrorist sped from a walk to a sprint. The terrorist fired randomly, shattering the glass in the foyer of the medical department building as Dusty quickly ducked back into the classroom. Dusty shouldered open the door to the lab room and pointed to the back exit, where everyone else stared at him in shock and awe. "Go, now!" No one moved at first, but then Professor Edwards snapped out of his stupor and stepped in to help Dusty move everyone to safety.
"Come on, he's right. We can't stay here," Edwards said.
Dusty reached for Claire's hand, and she squeezed it tight, pressing against him closely as they retreated. Dusty made sure Claire was the first one through the door, and then glanced back to the room's entrance in time to hear the gunmen shooting another screaming victim. The percussive blasts of the gunshots echoed more loudly in the hallways, each boom triggering gasps and cries as they forced their wobbly legs through the back door. Dusty stayed at the exit, making sure everyone made it through, keeping his eyes on the front door to the lab. When the last student was through the exit, Dusty disappeared inside and shut the door behind him. Just before the terrorist entered the lab, Dusty remained by the door, holding it in place because there were no manual locks. The room they had entered was void of any windows. The only light was a tiny sliver that penetrated the bottom of the door. It was just enough for Dusty to see Claire's face and a few frightened expressions from the other students. Dusty held his finger to his lips, hoping anyone who could see him understood they needed to be as quiet as possible. But with so many people stuffed into such a tiny room, Dusty feared they had made a mistake cornering themselves. Dusty found the professor as his eyes adjusted to the darkness and leaned closer to him. He lowered his voice to a barely audible whisper. "Is there another exit out of here?" Dusty asked. Professor Edwards nodded.
"We are joined to another room, which goes to the other side of the building."
"Are you familiar with that path?" Dusty asked. "Can you lead them through the dark?"
"I think so,"
Edwards answered. "Go," Dusty said. "I'll hold the door." Professor Edwards quietly led the students through the darkened room, while Dusty listened to the terrorist walk around the lab. Dusty glanced behind him and saw Claire still waiting nearby. He mouthed for her to go, hoping she could see him, but Claire just shook her head. She was stubborn. It was one of the things he liked about her, but now wasn't the time for her to be so determined. The terrorist moved closer to their locked door. If he chose to open fire, the bullets would easily penetrate the flimsy wood. Once Edwards pushed all the students into the next room, he motioned for Dusty and Claire to follow. But Dusty feared if they moved now, they would make too much noise. But sitting idle was just as dangerous. Dusty grabbed Claire's hand and pulled her through the room. He watched where he was going, moving slowly but steadily. All it would take was one misstep and their secrecy would be blown. When Dusty and Claire reached the back exit door, he believed they had escaped the worst of it. But then, one of the kids ahead sneezed. Dusty froze, squeezing Claire's hand harder as he braced for gunshots. But they didn't come, and for a moment, Dusty believed they had dodged a bullet. But then the front door was kicked down, flooding the room with sunlight from the lab windows. Dusty reacted instantly, pulling Claire through the exit as the professor slammed the door shut. The moment the door was closed, the terrorist opened fire. But while everyone else was afraid, Dusty jumped into action. "Everyone, keep moving, now!" Dusty shouted, pushing everyone out of their paralysis, because he knew that if they stayed there, they would die. "Don't stop," Dusty said, coaxing everyone forward. "One foot in front of the other. Let's go, let's go, let's go!" Dusty kept his eyes focused ahead of him, but he occasionally glanced behind him where the thunder of gunfire sounded right on his heels. He had gone hunting with his mother, stalking animals in the woods, but he had never been in a situation where he was hunted. The world was a blur, and Dusty only caught glimpses of their surroundings as they made their way through the building's back rooms, never letting go of Claire's hand. Between the gunshots and the screams from the other students, Dusty was deaf by the time he saw the light. He didn't know how many had survived the escape when they burst into the classroom on the opposite side of the building. The door had led them onto the lecture stage with rows of empty seating, stretching outward and upward like a theater. Freedom was at the top stairs, and Dusty never broke his stride as they made their way to the exit. But just before Dusty was about to leave the classroom, Claire yanked his arm hard, stopping him in his tracks. He didn't stop at first and tried to pull her away, but she broke her hand free from his grip, and he spun around. Dusty couldn't hear what she was screaming at him, but he could see the blood on the professor's stomach as two students tried to support him and carry him up the stairs. It was then that Dusty saw how few had made it, and lying in the doorway of the buildings they had just gone through, a hand protruded through the darkness. Dusty couldn't see the student's face, but the lifeless hand lay still and rigid, highlighted by the sunlight creeping into the room.
Dusty!
Claire's voice was muffled, but it finally broke through Dusty's paralysis.
We need to help him!
At first, Dusty thought Claire was talking about the dead student in the doorway, but then he realized she was talking about the professor, who was shot but still alive. Dusty pushed past Claire and helped the other students carry the professor up the steps. Keeping one eye on the door, waiting for the terrorists to kill them all. They were sitting ducks on those classroom steps and needed to get out fast. When they finally reached the exit to the classroom, the professor's legs gave way, and he collapsed into the hallway.
Professor, come on,
Dusty said, pulling the man up. Professor Edwards shook his head.
I can't. I'm sorry, but I just can't.
The other students stayed on the floor with the professor, crying. Only Dusty and Claire remained on their feet. All Dusty could think about was getting out of that hallway, off campus and to safety, wherever that might be.
We can't leave them,
Claire said. But that was precisely what Dusty wanted to do. He was angry with their weakness and how their fear paralyzed them. If they just wanted to give up and die, then let them. But then Dusty saw Claire's defiance. She wasn't going to leave, and Dusty wasn't going to leave her. If they couldn't run anymore, then there was only one solution: to fight. Stay here, Dusty said. And then he ducked back into the classroom before anyone could stop him. Dusty hid behind the last row of seats as the terrorist stepped over the dead body in the doorway, barely missing those fingers that were still outstretched toward freedom that they would never touch. Dusty was hunched, struggling to keep his breathing under control, but he closed his eyes and focused on lowering his heart rate. His mother had always told him that he could control the moment, or the moment could control him. That was the first advice she gave him when they were hunting. They had been so nervous about pulling the trigger, so scared of the dangers of the forest. He had never enjoyed it as much as his mother, but she had forced him to learn. And now, Dusty recalled all that training to fight back. Without a weapon, Dusty knew he would have to subdue the terrorist quickly. It was all about speed and accuracy. In addition to hunting, his mother taught him other skills. And while Dusty never wanted to hurt anyone, which was why he wanted to become a doctor in the first place, he would fight to stay alive. The terrorist made no effort to keep quiet on his walk up the stairs, each heavy footfall growing louder and closer as he neared the top. Dusty figured the guy was arrogant, never anticipating any resistance from the students who had come there to learn. But Dusty had more than book smarts in him. His mother had made sure of it. By the time the terrorist reached the top of the stairs, Dusty had calmed himself down. And when the terrorist crossed the final row, Dusty pounced. It was all surprisingly natural for him. The ease in which Dusty was able to wrap his arms around the terrorist's neck, squeeze him, and bring the man to his knees. The man had dropped his weapon the moment Dusty had applied pressure to his neck, but Dusty struggled to choke him out.
All it would take was one quick snap of the neck, killing the man and ending the struggle. But even after watching him kill people, knowing that he wouldn't hesitate to kill Dusty and his friends, Dusty still couldn't bring himself to do it. And it cost him. The terrorist gathered a final burst of strength and pushed up off the floor, catapulting Dusty and himself back down onto the steps they had climbed just moments ago. Dusty rolled violently, flipping over his shoulders, the harsh edges of the floor banging against bone. Dusty finally righted himself halfway down, but so did the terrorist. Both men were slow to get up, but Dusty was a half-second faster, and he charged at the terrorist and managed to land a few quick blows to the face and ribs. But the terrorist countered with a stiff blow to Dusty's chin, knocking him backward. The sudden burst of white light against a backdrop of darkness blinded him, and he continued backpedaling until his vision returned. By then, the terrorist was charging forward again, and Dusty saw the knife just in time to evade it when it slashed through the air. The terrorist kept up a heavy assault, and Dusty struggled to regain his footing. Every time the blade sliced through the air, Dusty saw his life flash before his eyes. It wasn't until Dusty was backed up against the wall that he managed to snatch the terrorist's wrists and twist the blade from his hand. But the move exposed Dusty's jugular, and the terrorist clamped his hand down over it and pressed him up against the wall. Unlike Dusty, the terrorist showed no restraint as he squeezed, choking the life out of Dusty. Dusty kicked and punched and scratched and clawed, fighting for his life, but the terrorist wouldn't relent. And just when Dusty saw the blackness about to fall over his eyes, a gunshot rang out, and the pressure on his neck was released. Both Dusty and the terrorist collapsed to the floor. Dusty gasping for air as he slowly regained consciousness. And when he did, he saw Claire standing nearby, the smoking gun in her hand that the terrorist had used, and a look of shock on her face.
"Oh my God,"
Claire said, dropping the weapon. Dusty looked at the terrorist, making sure he was dead, and then quickly patted him down, taking a few rounds of ammunition off him. Then he walked over to Claire, his throat still raw and sore and raspy.
"Are you all right?"
Dusty asked. Claire was still in shock, but they didn't have time to waste. There were still other terrorists on the campus, and they weren't out of the woods yet.
"Claire, we need to go,"
Dusty said, picking up the gun and pulling her toward the exit. When they stepped back into the hallway, the other two students were still with the professor, who was alive, but barely.
"I think we stopped the bleeding," one of the students said. "But his pulse is slowing down."
Dusty recalled everything they'd learned so far and knew they needed to check to see if the bullet was still inside. They rolled the professor to his side, and Dusty didn't find an exit wound.
"We need to get the bullet out and hook him up to an IV,"
Dusty said, and then he closed his eyes and tried to think.
"We should get him back to the clinical labs. They'll have what we need in there to help him."
"I can't,"
the professor said, lazily shaking his head from side to side.
"I can't keep going."
"Yes, you can,"
Dusty said.
"On 3, we lift him. 1, 2, 3.
Everyone hoisted the professor up, who could no longer stand alone. Claire helped while Dusty led them through the hallways, gun up and at the ready. He only hoped he didn't have to use it. Chapter 6. The trek back to town was quick. Lacey didn't want to abandon her people at the visitor center, but they were outnumbered. They needed Tommy's deputies, but while Tommy wanted the manpower, Lacey wanted information. Lacey took control of Eddie as they neared town, wanting a crack at him before they tossed him into a cell. "What do you know about them?" Lacey asked. Eddie said nothing, keeping his eyes forward. He was incredibly sure-footed, but that made sense, considering how hard it had been to catch him over the past 6 months. "Hey," Lacey said, stepping in front of Eddie and stopping him. "I asked you a question. What did you see them doing out there?"
"They were scouting for something,"
Eddie answered.
"I didn't know what."
"You were afraid when you saw them," Lacey said. You're not going to tell me why?
Eddie tilted his head to the side and then narrowed his eyes.
I don't normally back down from a fight, but I know you don't stand in front of a charging bull.
What's that supposed to mean?
Tommy asked. They're dangerous, Lacey said, but I need specifics.
You want specifics? You'll have to talk to them,
Eddie said.
I work alone, and I'm not looking to make friends.
But you're like them, Lacey said. Eddie smiled.
And what do you know about me?
I know you've been catching bears and selling them to the Chinese bile farms, Lacey answered. You know what they do to those poor animals at those factories? They cut them open while they're still alive, bleed the bile from their gallbladders, keeping them locked up in cages. Do you know how slow their death is?
I know exactly what they do and how they do it,
Eddie answered.
Humans are the apex predators. You should know that above everyone else, Lacey.
Lacey grimaced. She didn't like the sound of her name coming out of his mouth. You don't know anything about me.
You don't think I study an area before entering the jungle?
Eddie asked.
I know all about the great Lacey Stone. The guardian of the forest. That's what they used to call you, wasn't it?
Lacey flushed hot, but she restrained herself from striking him.
But I heard you have an interesting new nickname,
Eddie said, smiling wider.
The Black Widow.
Lacey grabbed Eddie by the neck and slammed him against a nearby tree. She didn't even realize she had her hands on the man's throat until Tommy peeled her off him.
What are you doing?
Tommy asked, standing between Lacey and Eddie.
Are you trying to give his lawyers a free pass to keep him out of jail?
Eddie only laughed as he coughed and tried to catch his breath.
I'm glad to see the rumors are true. The wife who killed her husband.
Lacey charged again, but Tommy was able to stop her before she got too close.
That's enough,
Tommy said.
He's just trying to get under your skin.
Lacey understood that, but that didn't make his words easier to swallow. She had lived with those rumors in town ever since Sean's death, but Tommy had investigated the death personally, and it was ruled a hunting accident. And Lacey had convinced herself it was true. He talks again, and I'm going to staple his mouth shut, Lacey said.
You were the one asking questions,
Eddie said. Lacey clenched her hands into fists and let Tommy handle Eddie for the rest of the walk. But she remained irked by his comment. It had been hard for Lacey and her family since Sean's death. Because of her work in the forest, she always had been a fixture in the community. However, her friends had suddenly stopped talking to her, and people whispered behind her back in town. Eventually, she just stopped going into town. When they finally reached Big Rock, named after their state forest near the mountain's base, they found that the EMP had affected everyone else in the community. Cars were stalled on the streets, and the lights were shut off, but there was another unexpected complication.
Oh no,
Tommy said. The same terrorist forces atop the mountain were now working their way down the hill and into town, seizing control. From their current position in the woods, Lacey and Tommy had a bird's-eye view of the town and the enemy. I see at least a dozen more terrorists, Lacey said, pointing to the sheriff's station the enemy had taken up as their command center. It looks like your guys are in trouble. Tommy stiffened. He had never been one to back down from a fight, and Lacey knew he wasn't a coward, but they had to be smart about this. There are too many to fight them head-on, Lacey said. We'll have to do this with some stealth. Lacey looked at Tommy, who was laser-focused on the enemy below. Hey, are you with me?
yeah.
Tommy said, then glanced back at Eddie.
What about him?
We'll tie him up and gag him, Lacey answered.
You don't think he'll try to escape?
Tommy asked. I know he will, Lacey answered. But he'll never get out of the restraints the way I tie them. Eddie didn't put up a fight as Lacey tied him up, but she found his silence more unsettling than an outburst. You try to break out of this, and I'll be the first person to put you back in them, Lacey said.
If you survive,
Eddie replied. Lacey tightened the restraints a little more, and then she turned toward Tommy, who was still watching the town. Come on, Lacey said. "I know a way down." Lacey knew every square inch of the woods around town, and she easily navigated them undetected toward the back of the sheriff's office.
"The back door should be open,"
Tommy said.
"Larry always takes his smoke breaks and never locks it. I've told him about it, but he doesn't care."
Lacey counted the men around the station, and she could only see 3 making the rounds on the perimeter. But that didn't mean there weren't more inside. "What if they locked it when they took over?" Lacey asked. Tommy patted his pockets until he found the keys to the building.
"This should get us in no problem."
"If they're inside, it would make sense for the terrorists to put the deputies in the cells, right?" Lacey asked. "That would make it easier to keep everyone under control."
"Right,"
Tommy answered. "We need to move quickly," Lacey answered. "The faster we take them by surprise, the easier this will be for us." Tommy nodded, nervous. "Hey," Lacey said. "Are you with me?"
"Yeah,"
Tommy answered.
"I can do this."
Tommy had been the sheriff for 5 years now, but he'd never dealt with anything more violent than a few drunk and disorderly down at the local bar. This was on another level. This was war. While Lacey had never been in a war, she had lived in the wild long enough to know that only the strong survived. She had hardened her mind and body against nature's harshest elements, and she would call upon all her strength for this fight. On Lacey's command, she and Tommy sprinted from the woods toward the station's back door. It was unlocked, just as Tommy said it would be, and they ducked inside before the terrorists walked around the back perimeter. Lacey waited for the terrorists to march past, ensuring they had escaped detection, and then turned her attention to the next phase of their plan. It was dark in the back of the station, but there was a light at the end of the hallway. Voices carried from the front of the building to the back. Lacey couldn't hear exactly what was said, but the tone was hurried and angry. Despite the terrorists' control over the town, it appeared not everything was going to plan. Lacey and Tommy wanted to use that to their advantage, but first, they needed backup. "Where are the cells?" Lacey asked.
"Just around that corner in the hallway,"
Tommy answered, and then he frowned. And Lacey figured something was wrong. "What?" Lacey asked.
"If my deputies are locked up, I don't have the keys to the cell on me,"
Tommy answered.
"They're in a locker at the back of the office."
The pair moved silently down the hall. Lacey was surprised at how quiet Tommy was, but there weren't any twigs and leaves to crunch on. When they neared the end of the hallway, they paused in the shadow, keeping out of the light as Lacey peered around the corner. Lacey found the deputies in the cells, all of them at the bars, watching the terrorists in the office. She counted 4 deputies, more than enough to help take back control of the station if they could get them out. Lacey then spied the locker Tommy had spoken of, and it was directly in the line of sight from where the terrorists were gathered. She counted at least 3 of them inside, plus the 2 outside and several more crawling around town. "I'm going for the keys," Lacey said, turning back to Tommy.
"Are you crazy? They'll see you," Tommy said.
"There isn't another way to get your deputies out of that cell, is there?" Lacey asked. Tommy was quiet, and then he shook his head. "All right, then we don't have a lot of options," Lacey answered. "Watch my back. If they spot me, you'll have a good chance of at least taking one of them out, and I'll be able to take the other. Once we have them on the run, we keep them on the run. Got it?"
"It's risky,"
Tommy answered. "I know," Lacey replied, "but I've never been afraid to roll the dice." Lacey didn't wait for Tommy. She rounded the corner and moved stealthily toward the locker. Years of hunting had trained her body and mind to move efficiently and quietly, and all those hours in the woods served her well now. The terrorists had their masks down inside the station, and Lacey caught glimpses of their faces. It wasn't anyone she recognized, but they all spoke English. Lacey made it to the locker and quietly opened the door, shutting it with just a crack once inside. The wall to her left had all the building's keys, including the cells, each labeled for their correct use. Lacey grabbed the keys to the cell and turned back toward the door. The terrorists' argument was growing more intense, and when Lacey opened the door, someone threw a chair,
knocking over some of the computer screens on one of the desks.
We don't have time for this!
The man was red-faced, saliva dripping down his lower lip and chin. Lacey tried to move as quickly as possible, but because the man was turned toward the back after he threw the chair, he and Lacey locked eyes when she stepped out of the locker room. While he was still stunned with confusion, Lacey raised her gun to shoot and squeezed the trigger. The gunshot struck the man in the chest, and he went down. And then, the entire police station erupted into gunfire. Lacey raced back to the cell, wanting to reach the deputies before she caught a bullet, and once she reached the hallway, Tommy provided cover for her as she opened the cells.
"Where are your weapons?" Lacey asked.
"It's the same locker where you got the keys. But I think they stole all the weapons out of there when we came in."
Deputy Milton answered. Lacey handed over 2 of her pistols. "Get in the fight and get them out of the station. We need to secure the building." With the added firepower, it didn't take long to put the terrorists on their heels, but pushing them entirely out of the building was a slow process. The back door was also kicked down, and the 2 terrorists who were walking the perimeter burst inside, pinning Lacey and the deputies between the 2 forces. Lacey focused on the 2 in the back and winged one of them while the second sprinted away. She hurried to the shot terrorist and disarmed him while he wailed about a bullet in his shoulder, but he didn't get any sympathy from her.
"They're gone,"
Tommy said, catching his breath as he walked back over to where Lacey was with the wounded terrorist. "Good," Lacey said, and then she aimed her weapon at the injured man's head. "Why are you here?"
"Fuck you,"
the man said. Lacey lowered the weapon and aimed it at the man's leg. She squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the meaty part of his thigh. The man screamed, and Lacey applied pressure on it with her boot. "If I have to ask again, then I shoot the other leg," Lacey said. The man squirmed for a long time, but eventually stopped and found his voice.
"This is a strategic location for us."
"Location to do what?" Lacey asked.
"That was above my pay grade,"
the man answered. Lacey applied pressure, and the man screamed again.
"I'm telling the truth, Jesus!"
the man shouted, and Lacey removed her foot. "What other buildings are your people occupying?" Lacey asked.
"The main objectives were taking over the town hall, the sheriff's station, and the school,"
he said. Lacey stiffened. "The school?"
"Yeah. The people in charge figured that if we could control the school, we could control the parents."
This time, he looked up at Lacey with a hint of a smile.
"You got kids?"
Lacey almost put a bullet in the man's head, and if it hadn't been for Tommy's intervention, then she probably would have. But instead, she kicked the man in the chin and knocked him unconscious. Lacey headed toward the door, but Tommy went after her.
"You need to think this through," Tommy said. "We need to get organized."
"By the time you're organized, my daughter could be in worse trouble than she is now," Lacey said.
"Wait."
Tommy stepped in front of her, blocking her exit.
"We can help. Just give me a minute. You know you could use the backup."
Lacey didn't want to admit that he was right. "You have 1 minute." Tommy nodded and then rushed to collect his deputies, allowing Lacey to catch her breath. Her children were more important to her than anything else in life. If something happened to them, she would never forgive herself. And she would never stop hurting the people responsible for their pain.